This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Please, please, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Also, comment below. I want to know what you think, and it really helps out with the algorithm. So, this is part 4 of our Synastry series, and we're going to be talking about hard aspects between Pluto and the moon. So for those of you who need a little refresher, synastry is where we take two people's natal charts and we compare them to see how they interact. So that means we look at how one person's planets aspect the other person's, and then where one person's planets fall in the other person's chart in terms of houses and other things. So this is primarily for romantic relationships, but you can do it for friends, family, coworkers, whatever. Now, when we're looking at synastry, we're reading the chart in two primary ways. Number one, the modern or psychological way, in which planets and points are interior or psychological parts of ourselves. And then the other way that we also read is the ancient or traditional way, in which planets and points, they represent actual people, places, and things in our lives. We need both dimensions, really, to understand our relationships, because on the one hand, they are psychological collisions. We crash into each other, as I always say. We push each other's buttons that we never even knew we had. And new things arise from the association. So now, and we also have to deal with very real things in our lives with our relationships. So both modes of interpretation are very important. As we've said in the past, one person is embodied by one planet in a specific aspect, and the other person embodied in the other planet. For example, if I have, say, Venus, my Venus, square your Jupiter, that makes me the Venus person and you the Jupiter person. Does that make sense? Wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Pluto and the moon, either in square, opposition, or conjunction. Yes, I do include conjunctions as a hard aspect, especially when they're conjunct a hard or malefic planet. And I would definitely include Pluto under those sorts of categories. Now, what's Pluto? Just as a refresher, because, I've done other Pluto videos. He's death. He's power, our dominance, our sense of fear and trauma, obsession, hoarding wealth, the things that well up from the underworld and under the surface. He rules the subterranean things, the things that we would have liked to forget. And sort of our darker nature, the things that we hide about ourselves. Having Pluto aspects in synastry isn't bad by itself, right? I mean, it brings depth to relationships. Some of us need that sort of thing, right? Especially Pluto people. And you may remember that Pluto people, at least my definition, are people with heavy Pluto aspects to personal planets, but in particular, the sun, moon, or ascendant, the ascendant degree. So now, these types of relationships, we want to go to hell and back with each other. We want to soar to ecstatic heights and plunge to unfathomable lows. We're not satisfied with superficial or just physically based relationships, although that is very important to Pluto people. But we need the whole person. It's like we want to wear their skin. It's sort of creepy, isn't it? We want to bleed together, heal together, share our hurts together. Now, the hard Pluto aspects, we've talked about easy ones before, but the hard ones can be quite hard. They can show us a relationship that's rife with jealousy, possessiveness, deception, toxic behavior, or abuse. I'm thinking of the movie The Labyrinth here, right? Like, Sarah, bow down and worship me, and I will be your slave. I mean, gosh, think of all that stuff we watched as kids, and no wonder us millennials are so screwy now, Turn back, Sarah. I mean, gosh. Anyway, you have no power over me. Remember that. Remember that if you're the moon person embroiled in a Plutonian struggle. You have no power over me. Anyway, I digress. Well, what about the moon here? Remember, the moon is our emotional tides, our moods, the ebb and flow, the flux and reflux of our emotions. It's our unconscious nature, what we do without thinking about it, right? We're making the unconscious conscious. It's how we respond to fear, what we're afraid of, or how we find emotional security. It can show us our unconscious patterns and tendencies, right? Now, moon aspects are very important in synastry. Why? Because it can show us how we feel around the other person. It can lead us into a sense of security and feeling supported, or it can lead us into having our emotions be trampled by the other person. You see, because the moon is very loving and giving by nature, almost to the point of her own detriment. You see, because she's naive and trusting, and she can be very devoted and giving beyond her capacity. I always tell you all, you can't give from an empty cup. You're no good to anyone else if you're drowning. So, now how about when the moon and Pluto come together in squares, oppositions, or conjunctions? Well, number one, squares are the worst aspect, aren't they? I'm sorry, the second worst aspect. The second worst, right? They're in the nature of Mars and can indicate disharmony, conflict, dissonance. These are quicker type conflicts, Mars-like, more abrupt, cutting things off, you see? Whereas oppositions are the worst aspect. They are in the nature of Saturn. They represent the struggle between opposing forces, long and drawn-out conflicts, persistent malaise, and unhappiness. Right? This means that we see a potential conflict between one person's sense of power, trauma, pain, and possession with the other person's need for emotional security and safety. These are very compelling relationships, though, with very intense emotions. You might remember that U2 song. I always think of this, right? With or without you. I can live with or without you. Oh, right? I can't live with or without you. It's a great summary of this sort of dynamic because we have very strong feelings that develop very quickly. And we have to be very careful about moving too fast because that's what leads us oftentimes into abuse and to trauma bonding. And you may recall that trauma bonding is where one person forms an unhealthy bond with their abuser. They come to identify with their abuse and almost accept it. And we see this as where the moon becomes very codependent on Pluto, and Pluto exploits it. Now remember, this can go both ways. It's not always the Pluto person that's always bad or whatever. This indicates a dynamic. But typically the Pluto person is the one trying to hold on to the situation. Pluto seems wounded to the moon, which is very attractive to her because she has this natural inclination to heal him. Oh, I can save him. I can save him. He's just misunderstood. The moon loves the Pluto bad boy, doesn't she? And deep down, Pluto is insecure and will oftentimes very gladly drain the moon of her vitality, because he's filling a hole inside himself. Pluto may derive a sense of power and confidence from belittling or demeaning the moon. And Pluto becomes what? Possessive and jealous. He's always scared the other person may leave, right? And then he sort of expresses this facade of arrogance and toxic behavior that's really just a manifestation of his fear and insecurity. And the primary danger here is that the relationship sort of degenerates into abuse. Typically, this is emotional abuse when Moon Pluto is involved, which it can be even more painful sometimes to the moon than the physical stuff because The emotions are her realm. And she's so sensitive. And she just wants a sense of security and safety. Now, degrading the moon and whittling down her confidence are part of Pluto's MO. He tricks her into thinking that she needs him. He keeps her around in order to fulfill his own selfish desires sometimes, to fill that empty hole. And Pluto can sometimes resort to love bombing and manipulation to get what he wants. So love bombing is where, after being sort of cold and unemotional for weeks, Pluto goes to Venus and says, oh my gosh, I love you. You're so beautiful. You're so sweet. Oh my gosh. When he just wants something. And this is a type of manipulation. Also gaslighting, right? Making the moon think that she's crazy, mistrusting her own perceptions of reality. Pluto telling the moon, oh, you're overreacting. No, you're being too sensitive. No. You have a feeling of what's going on, and your feelings are valid. Now, usually this is about control for Pluto to distract from his own insecurities. Non-Pluto people can feel absolutely bonkers in these situations. They make no sense. Excuse me. They're not accustomed to this type of energy. They're not accustomed to everything in life being a life or death situation or being an emergency. Pluto relationships have this sense of urgency of things being life or death. And it can get extremely exhausting for people. Even Pluto people sometimes. It's extremely difficult for these people to break up because of all the jealousy, lies, and manipulation. We've built unhealthy bonds oftentimes based on shared pain and trauma. We develop a sense of needing the other person or owning the other person or being owned. An ex-partner once told me they felt like I was their property. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, that's so hot. And then you realize what they really mean. And it's not so hot anymore. This also indicates couples that get so attached that they can't escape each other. Now, you'll see these significations apply to both the square and the opposition. But of course, the opposition is a bit more difficult. Well, it can be significantly more difficult because it indicates that these issues are persisting and festering underneath the surface, creating resentment and fear between couples. Now, the conjunction is also a hard aspect, like I said here, but it's got the potential to be a lot nicer. You see, because the conjunction is more a blending of these energies. And believe me, in Synastry, Pluto conjunct Venus, the sex can be so hot. It's just like, oh my God. Like, spit your blood into my mouth, mommy, please, please, please. I mean, anyway. But you get the idea. The sex can be so hot. And there's this sense of passion and kink, right? For those of you who aren't aware of what kink is sort of unconventional relationships and sexual relations, always consensual, always safe, and always sane. That's what we always say. Safe, sane, and consensual, right? So, and this is very important because Pluto is also the ruler of things like non-consent. Pluto is force. And it's very important for Pluto people to recognize that that is not okay. You cannot infringe on other people's will. So, now with the conjunction also, you can see the same pitfalls. You can see it degenerate into jealousy, possessiveness, and even abuse. But you also see the added good potentiality for a very healing and very passionate, intense relationship. Something that can be very fulfilling to both people, especially if they like that sort of thing. So, now the squares and the oppositions are not a death sentence, even though they can manifest as toxic behavior. They don't always have to. Plutonian people can sometimes thrive off of this type of thing, especially those who thrive off of crises and coming to terms with things. Of course, toxic people like this kind of stuff too, but that's another story. Now, this does work well, or can work well, in kink or dominant submission relationships, as we said before. In dominance and submission relationships are where one person willingly, consensually gives up their power to their partner based on mutually agreed upon terms. So, like I said, super hot sex. And it can be so exhilarating. It can feel like fate, like this was meant to be. Like, you are my density. I mean, destiny. It can feel like ownership. And then the twin flame bullshit. I call it bullshit because it is. You don't find yourself through someone else. The idea is that you have another half to your soul somewhere that's in someone else. And in order to be a whole person, you have to meet them and unionize, unite. Again, after having gone through relationships with people who claimed they were twin flames, and which actually ended up being abusive relationships, I can tell you unequivocally that you do not find yourself in someone else. In fact, the Buddha even said, you have to learn to be your own refuge. So sometimes I see these aspects in long-term marriages, surprisingly, because they've been to hell and back together. Now, I don't like to see this in synastry readings, but that doesn't mean it can't work. Any aspect can work, especially these hard ones, as long as both people sincerely love each other and sincerely want to work together, to heal together, and to be in a relationship together. We have to constantly re-fall in love with each other, to fall in love again, because we change as people, especially Pluto people. We're constantly transforming. But in order to stay in love, we have to get to know that new person and fall in love with them over and over. Relationships are a lifelong commitment, unless you don't want them to be. So, now, in this case, Pluto must learn to see his toxic behavior and recognize the harm it's doing. He needs to be able to sincerely appreciate the moon to the point that he wants to feed her too. Not just take. On the other hand, the moon must be able to stand up for herself rather than falling into enchantment from Pluto's dark allure. She must demand the security and the safety that she needs. You see? No relationship will ever be fulfilling until you're willing to walk away. Because when we're too scared to walk away, we slip in a codependency spiral and allow ourselves to be manipulated and treated like garbage. So as always, the key is communication, being honest, direct, and respectful with each other. When you recognize something isn't working, then you have to make a call. And sometimes you have to boogie on out. Anyway, please again like and subscribe. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I love you very much. I give wonderful readings. All my information is below. Thank you for supporting me and have a wonderful whatever you're having. And now we will end the transmission.